Welcome to the Paducah Human Rights Commission, PHRC television show, Raising the Standard. And we have our co-host today, our chairperson, Dr. Bernice Belt. Welcome, Dr. Belt.
Hello, Commissioner Jeter.
We're glad to have you on today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And before we begin, we will start with the mission statement. And I want you to know, no one should be discriminated against in this area because of their race, their color, their religion, national origin, their age from 40 to 70, nor any disabilities. And you will see our mission statement on the show. And at this time, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a wonderful, wonderful show today. We have with us Amanda Gregory, and she's from the Assistant United States Attorney's Office in Louisville, Kentucky. And we also have FBI agent Mike Brown. And our subject matter today will be regarding civil rights and human trafficking. So let's just welcome Amanda Gregory. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you, ladies. I'm very happy to be here today. Happy to get out here to Paducah. I don't get a chance to travel out to this part of the state a lot, and it's beautiful.
Welcome aboard. We're glad to have you today. And you are a prosecuting attorney, is that correct?
Yes, I'm an assistant U.S. attorney at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Kentucky, which is based out of Louisville. And I work at the office in Louisville.
Wonderful. And Dr. Belt, do you have any questions for her?
Yes, I'd like to join you in welcoming you, and just for the viewing audience sake, I'll probably refer to you largely as assistant attorney. And that's because I just want them to attach that to you as we continue to visit with you during this segment of PHRC Raising the Standard. And we thank you for being with us today. Because of your presence, we will begin raising the standard for the brand new year.
Yes, yes.
As the prosecutor and the civil rights coordinator for criminal cases, would you tell us the context in which you serve as in the U.S. Attorney's Office and how it fits in with the Department of Justice?
Okay, well, I'm the criminal civil rights coordinator for the office. I'm also a member of the economic crimes and healthcare fraud unit. So my workload is predominantly federal white-collar crimes, but I also coordinate our criminal civil rights crimes. One of the reasons I was happy to get the opportunity to come here today is to talk more about the U.S. Attorney's Office, because I think a lot of people don't really know what the U.S. Attorney's Office is.
Right.
There are a lot of laws, and there are a lot of lawyers going around enforcing these laws in different government offices. So I think some people, even members of my own family, have a tendency to get the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is a federal office, confused with the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, which is a county office, or the State Attorney General's Office, which is a state office. The U.S. Attorney's Office is part of the U.S. Department of Justice, which is a federal government agency in the executive branch. The U.S. Department of Justice is responsible for enforcing all federal law, both civil and criminal, and for representing the United States in court. The head of the U.S. Department of Justice is the United States Attorney General, who is a presidentially appointed person, confirmed by the Senate, and who sits on the President's cabinet. The current U.S. Attorney General is Eric Holder, again to be distinguished from the State Attorney General, Jack Conway. And the U.S. Attorney General is responsible for directing both the policy objectives of the litigating divisions of the Department of Justice, but also for sort of setting out the objectives for the federal law enforcement agencies that are part of the Department of Justice, like the FBI, ATF. Like most federal government agencies, the headquarters of the Department of Justice is in D.C. There are litigating divisions like the criminal division, the civil rights division, the civil division, the antitrust division, and there are also different offices that focus more on policy issues like the Office of Legal Counsel, the Office of Legal Policy. The Department of Justice is sometimes referred to as the world's largest law firm,
Right.
Because it employs over 10,000 attorneys. I think most of those attorneys are, in fact, employed at Justice headquarters in D.C., and each of the divisions is divided up into subject matter sections. And so the attorneys there, they have more of a expertise in specific subject matter areas, and they might work on cases in that subject matter all over the country. Also in DC are the federal law enforcement agencies. They're part of the Department of Justice that I mentioned, like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the U.S. Marshal Service, the Drug Enforcement Agency. Each of those agencies have their own director, and they have their own agendas, but they are ultimately report to the U.S. Attorney General, and they're part of the Department of Justice.
Right.
When we were reviewing your website, Commissioner Jeter and I noted that there were several, and we were careful not to call them divisions. We weren't sure to call them divisions, but there were several sub-areas under which I suppose would be your umbrella responsibility. And I think there were at least 5, and there were some sub-areas. On your website, if our viewing audience were to go to that website, what would be some of those areas that they would see on your first and second page of your website?
Well, again, it depends on if you're talking about the U.S. Department of Justice website or the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Kentucky. As I mentioned, the Department of Justice has divisions like the Antitrust Division, the Civil Division, the Criminal Division. The U.S. Attorney's Office, so other than the Justice Headquarters in D.C., the other main component of the Department of Justice is the U.S. Attorney's Offices, which are spread out all over the country. It's sort of the field offices of the Department of Justice, if you will. There are 94 judicial districts with district courts in each district, and there's a United States Attorney's Office in each judicial district. In Kentucky, there are 2 judicial districts, the Eastern District of Kentucky and the Western District of Kentucky, which is based in Louisville. I work in the Louisville office in the Western District of Kentucky, and in our office, we're divided into 3 divisions. There's the criminal section, and in the criminal section, the attorneys in that section, who are known as Assistant United States Attorneys, like I am, or AUSAs, are responsible for representing the United States in federal prosecutions in the Western District of Kentucky. The civil section, which there are 2 types of litigation. They can initiate lawsuits to enforce federal law, or they can represent the United States when someone may sue the United States either to challenge a law or because they were injured on federal property. So those are the types of cases the civil section does. And then there's an appellate section, which can deal with both criminal and civil cases when they're appealed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Those are our main sections. There are further specialties within each section. As I mentioned earlier, I work in the economic and healthcare fraud section of the criminal section, and I also do some civil rights crimes. There are a lot of attorneys in our office. There are 36 attorneys in all. 22 work in the criminal section, 9 in the civil section, and then the rest are either appellate or management. Just as the U.S. Attorney General is the overall head of the Department of Justice, each U.S. Attorney's Office is headed by a presidentially appointed U.S. Attorney. In our office, that's currently David Hale, who was appointed in 2010. And since it's a presidentially appointed position, that means that with every administration that position is likely to change. But all the other attorneys who work in the office, the line attorneys, they are career positions, which means they don't change from administration to administration. And in fact, people like working there so much, usually they don't change until people retire.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, kind of changing the subject a little bit, the Human Rights, our board, as far as our complaints, we receive a lot of complaints as far as housing, discrimination, or employment. So would you please provide our viewers with the overview of these laws and how they are enforced by your office?
So with many areas, and civil rights is one of these areas, the assistant U.S. attorneys in any given office, including our office, might work with the attorneys that I mentioned before who work at the divisions in D.C. So there's the Civil Rights Division in D.C., and The Civil Rights Division is divided into 9 subsections with attorneys who have different specialties. So you're talking about housing and employment. So there's one of the sections is the housing and civil enforcement section, and there's the employment litigation section, and there's the disabilities rights section. And those 3 sections might have subject matter expertise on issues that citizens of Paducah might bring to the Human Rights Commission. If someone thinks they're being discriminated against based on a disability, then the disability rights section would have jurisdiction over the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. And that basically requires that people with disabilities not be discriminated against, or that reasonable accommodations be made for people with disabilities. It applies to employers if the employer has 15 or more employees. So the employer has to be a certain size before the act will apply. But if they have more than 15 employees, then the act would apply, and they would have to make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities.
Okay.
It also applies to state and local government agencies in whatever they do, be it public programs or public transits, or building buildings, but also when they're providing employment. And it also applies to public accommodations. And under the ADA, the basic standard is, as I mentioned, reasonable accommodation. And that is measured primarily through whether making the accommodation will cause the employer or the government agency to undergo undue financial or administrative burden. Usually in an employment context, it might be getting a special kind of computer, or getting some audio headphones or something to help someone with a disability. With buildings or with public transit, it could get more expensive or more strenuous. And in DC, in the disability rights section, they actually employ architects who can look at buildings and assess whether reasonable accommodations can be made. So most of the sections in the Civil Rights Division, in addition to employing attorneys, they employ analysts and other investigators who help them in their civil enforcement objectives.
Briefly, would you explain the complaint process through your office?
It depends on what kind of complaint is being made. Right. If a complaint's being made under the Disability Rights Act, people can call our office, but most often we're going to refer them to the Civil Rights Division in DC and the Disability Rights Section in particular, because usually how the work is divided up in terms of the affirmative civil rights enforcement is a lot of the investigative work will be done by the Civil Rights Division in DC, because, as I mentioned, they employ investigators and analysts and architects who have this subject matter expertise. And then once the investigation is done and they determine that maybe a complaint is valid, then they're more likely to get our office involved, because there might be litigation. And if it's the U.S. Attorney's Office in each district is primarily responsible for representing the United States in the federal court of that district. So we would work with the attorneys from the main justice offices in D.C. At that point. But I believe the Disability Rights Section has on their webpage, they have a form that can be filled out to file a complaint. Or you can call the main office of the Civil Rights Division in D.C., and if you have any type of civil rights complaint, they can refer you to one of the appropriate of the 9 sections that I mentioned earlier. Or we've talked about 3 of them, but there are 9 in all. And
that's a lot of sections.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that their process is pretty much the same as ours. If someone has a complaint, they can go on our website and complete the form, or they can call our office. They'll come to our office and basically complete it and have it notarized, and we as the board will review it and send it upline if we have to. That's pretty much the same as what we do when you say.
Yeah, very similar.
Yeah, and again, it depends on what subject matter area it's in. So again, you had initially asked about employment and housing complaints. So the Disability Rights Section would handle those complaints if they dealt with disabilities. But again, if it was just if it was based on, for example, race or color, or national origin, or gender, or religion, then the employment litigation section would handle it, because they have jurisdiction over Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and that applies to those groups. But actually, in order for a complaint to be referred to the employment litigation section, it would have to first go to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That's the preliminary place that you file a complaint based on employment. And then if it's either it involves a state or local government employer, or if there's a pattern or practice of discrimination, then the employment litigation section at the Civil Rights Division might get involved. If there's a housing complaint, and it's, again, something based on discrimination based on race or color, national origin, gender, maybe marital status or age, then the Housing and Civil Enforcement section has jurisdiction over two statutes that frequently come up in this area: the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So the Fair Housing Act applies to landlords, real estate agents, mortgage lenders, and people like that. But then the Equal Credit Opportunity Act tries to make credit for getting a house more accessible for people, and tries to prevent discrimination in that area. So the Housing and Civil Enforcement section, they, as I mentioned, have their own investigators. They have testers who can go out into the field and maybe do some undercover work to determine whether...
We've heard about those testers.
Well, they go out into the field, they travel all over the country, and they determine whether, a particular apartment building or agency is employing discriminatory practices. And if there's a problem, then they have the jurisdiction to bring a lawsuit, and they'll probably work with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the particular district that they're investigating. Some of their cases, like, they have their own investigators, but some of their cases, I think, are referred to them by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, because they also have their separate investigators, but they refer the cases to the housing section for litigation.
And that's good. That's good. I kid about it, but that's good, because we don't want anybody to be discriminated against or feel bad because of their race or their color or their national origin. And that's what this board is for. We want everybody to be treated equally in this area, not only this area, federal level. So this is good. We need these things in place.
And we need for citizens to know what's going on. It's so easy to have things get kind of lost in all of the language, and it's kind of fearful to a lot of people who are not comfortable using this kind of language. And so it's a wonderful thing that we're able to kind of put this out there for people to see, for them to hear, to make reference to, and to increase our base knowledge. I think it makes us better citizens the more that we know, and the more that we know, the more we grow. And so I do want to say this also, Assistant U.S. Attorney Amanda Gregory. I do want to say this, that it's very encouraging to see women in these positions, because often, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the second segment of PHRC Raising the Standard, it's very important for women to be on the front line, because women are subjected to so many things that often men are not subjected to our knowledge, and to what we believe is obvious. And so we're grateful that you are in this position, and we're grateful for all the great men who are serving at your level of government.
Well, I'm grateful to be in the position, because I love my office and I love my job. But going back to the point you just made earlier about how it's sometimes confusing because people don't know what rights they have. I mean, one of the reasons is because there are so many different agencies that are really looking to enforce people's rights. It goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about how people get confused between the state attorney general's office and the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Commonwealth Attorney's Office or the county attorney's office. But what's important to know is that there are so many government agencies out there that are looking to protect people's rights, their civil rights, both civil and criminal, to make sure that people are not discriminated against and have the opportunity to participate in civic and political life.
This is good. Yes, this is good. And we have to support our sisters. We got to support each other. This is good. I think I had one more question. What does someone do who thinks they have had their rights violated?
It depends on, again, what kind of rights.
Say, for instance, in a criminal or civil.
Okay, so we haven't talked much about criminal civil rights, and I actually, so I started at the U.S. Attorney's Office in May of 2013, but before that I worked at the Civil Rights Division in D.C. for 6 years. And 2 of those I spent in the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division, which is a great place. Of the 9 different sections in the Civil Rights Division, the criminal section deals with all the criminal civil rights violations. The other 8 sections deal with civil rights violations. And the difference, because a lot of people probably don't understand this, between a criminal civil rights violation and a civil rights violation is primarily the nature of the harm and the type of punishment. So with a criminal civil rights violation, that's usually going to be someone has done something to hurt you or harm you or your property. Either they assaulted you or they destroyed your property or burned down your house or something like that. And the punishment is going to be prison time or some sort of fine that's paid to the state. With civil rights violations, it's usually that someone has failed to fulfill a duty that they have. So they did not provide some service they were supposed to provide, or they discriminated against someone. And in that case, the punishment is not going to be jail time, but instead it's going to be what's called injunctive relief, which means that the court will order that person to do something, either to stop their discriminatory conduct or to provide the services they were supposed to provide. So the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division has jurisdiction over hate crimes, crimes that involve the deprivation of rights due to official misconduct, human trafficking crimes, and those crimes are primarily investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, though they might also be investigated by other federal law enforcement agencies, or local law enforcement might do the investigation and work with the federal prosecutors to prosecute the crime. If someone has a criminal civil rights complaint, then they should contact the local FBI office. Here in Paducah, the closest FBI office is in Hopkinsville, I believe. But if you think you're a victim of a civil rights crime, that's a federal civil rights crime, then that's the best thing to do. Might be helpful. Should I talk a little about what a little more about the federal civil rights crime?
I would think so.
Yes,
because I'm a little confused here.
Okay. So hate crimes, the main hate crime statute is the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009. And that prohibits anyone from either causing bodily injury or attempting to cause bodily injury with a dangerous weapon based on someone's race, color, national origin, or religion. So it prohibits that in all circumstances. It also prohibits, in cases that involve interstate commerce or that occur on federal lands, the same type of conduct if it's done on the basis of someone's gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. And I think people might have some misconceptions when it comes to hate crimes because I guess the term hate crimes, it makes you think, oh, you have to hate this group.
Right.
It's okay for there to be a mixed motive. It's okay for you don't have to prove the prosecution doesn't have to prove that the crime was solely committed because of someone's race or solely committed because of someone's sexual orientation. Because most people, when they act, they have mixed motives. They do things for a number of reasons, but it has to be a significant reason that they did something was because they were motivated by a bias against this race or this sexual orientation.
At least one aspect, primarily one aspect of the multiple.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the main hate crime statute. There's also a hate crime statute that applies more specifically to people who are interfering with someone's housing rights based on their race, national origin, color, or religion. But those are hate crimes. The other main group of crimes that are prosecuted by the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division are official misconduct that results in the deprivation of rights, or what we call the color of law crimes. And that means that someone who's acting under color of law or in their official capacity willfully deprive someone of a right that's granted under the Constitution or under federal law. The misconduct in this case can cover a wide range of things. Most frequently, it's someone's being assaulted or sexually assaulted. It can involve theft or false arrest. And the official misconduct under color of law, that part means it has to be someone who has some sort of government position and is acting in their official capacity.
Right.
So frequently these cases are brought against corrections officers or police officers, but it can also include judges, prosecutors, anyone like a mayor, anyone who has some sort of government position and is acting in that capacity.
And that was the color of law?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And then on the local level, we would sometimes refer that to as an abuse of authority.
Yeah.
On a local level.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point, because a lot of the crimes that are prosecuted by the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division can also be prosecuted at a state or local level. And so frequently what they'll do is they'll wait to see how the state or local prosecution is going to play out, and then at the end of that investigation or the end of that prosecution, make a determination about whether there's going to be a federal prosecution. So one of the most famous color of law crime cases was the Rodney King trial. And there was a state prosecution in that case back in the 90s. And when the officers in that case were acquitted, obviously a lot of people weren't happy. There were riots in Los Angeles. And because of the acquittal, the Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Central District of California determined that there was still a federal interest in bringing federal charges in that case. So they had a separate federal trial. They indicted those same officers essentially for the same conduct, but in federal court, and then they got guilty verdicts. So that's one example of the Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office is being able to make sure the federal interest in civil rights are being vindicated.
Right.
The one other, and I know we're going to get to this more in the second half of the show, but as I mentioned, the other type of civil rights crime that the criminal section has jurisdiction over is human trafficking crimes, which, just as a brief overview, usually means it's compelled labor or compelled commercial sex acts.
Right.
This is outstanding. We thank you so much, and we're going to take a short break, and we hope our viewing audience is really enjoying chewing on this. And then we'll come back for our second half of PHRC Raising the Standard, and we're going to introduce another guest along with Assistant Attorney Gregory. Thank you. Stay tuned.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the show, Raising the Standard by the Paducah Human Rights Commission. And also, if you ever feel like you've had a discrimination, or you feel like you just maybe have questions or maybe have a complaint, don't hesitate to call our office at 270-444-8643. And my co-host again is Dr. Bernice Belt, which is the chairperson for the board. And Dr. Belt, I just want you to just introduce our distinguished guests. We're so happy to have them here.
Yes, ma'am, I will, Commissioner Jeter.
All right.
And thank you so much. Oh, and by the way, that number that Commissioner Jeter just gave you, that's to our secretary. And so it may be a lot easier if you would call that number, 270-444-8643, and you can speak directly with the secretary, or after our hours. You can leave a message for her, and she will expeditiously make sure we get that information. We welcome back Amanda Gregory, who is Assistant United States Attorney for the Western District of Kentucky. She is a federal prosecutor and the Civil Rights Coordinator for criminal cases, and her office is located in Louisville, which is the main office for the Western District of Kentucky. And she is going to be joined by another special guest, and we'll introduce him in just a moment. We want to say this, too, about Amanda Gregory. She has considerable experience in prosecution of those involved in human trafficking, and we're going to really do the very best we can on the second half of this segment. So let me introduce our special guest, along with who's going to be joining Amanda Gregory, and then we're going to get Amanda to define human trafficking. This gentleman, very distinguished gentleman, is not a stranger to Paducah or to the Paducah Human Rights Commission. He was special guest for an event we held right here on the campus of WKCTC. And this is Agent Mike Brown with the Federal Bureau of Investigation from the Bowling Green, Kentucky field office. And welcome, Agent Brown.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I tell you what, it took a while for us to get y'all here. Former Commissioner David White was the one who initiated everything, and so we miss him. We miss you, David, and we're so glad that all of you are here. So, Assistant U.S. Attorney Gregory, if you would, define human trafficking.
Well, human trafficking generally means compelled labor or commercial sex acts. People, I think, have some misconceptions about human trafficking, in part because the word traffic is involved in it. They usually think that has to involve some sort of movement, usually over borders, maybe international borders. But it may very well be that some trafficking crimes will involve the movement over borders, but that's not a requirement of human trafficking. Smuggling requires, like alien smuggling requires moving people over borders, but trafficking, people can stay in one place the whole time. There's also a misconception, I think, that trafficking may have to involve someone being kidnapped. I think sometimes maybe popular culture has put this idea in people's head, maybe that great movie with Liam Neeson, Taken. People get the idea that people who are being trafficked are people who are like going about their business, kidnapped off the street, and then forced into prostitution or to life in a slave trade or something. But that's not a requirement either. People can voluntarily enter into an agreement to provide labor, or they can voluntarily do any number of things, and then eventually the circumstances can change, and then it can still be human trafficking. It's just whether it is compelled labor or compelled commercial sex acts. For labor, it's labor that's compelled by usually force or coercion, and for commercial sex acts, it can be force, fraud, or coercion under the U.S. statutes.
Now, when you say fraud, what exactly do you mean?
Some sort of trickery that involves maybe getting someone to do something under false pretenses. Some cases in the sex trafficking, under the sex trafficking statutes, people may be brought over to the U.S. told that they're going to be in movies or going to get a modeling contract, but instead they're trapped over here and forced into commercial sex acts.
All right. Excellent. I'm sure that you shed a lot of light on the human trafficking, and then you emphasize the trafficking part of. Well, Agent Brown, first, would you share your background and experience as it relates to human trafficking?
Regarding human trafficking, generally I help facilitate investigations around the state, working with the state agencies to include the state police, local police departments, and with the FBI, working with the U.S. Attorney's Office. For instance, if a case comes to us from a local police department and they think it might have human trafficking elements in it, I will meet with them and review the case and help make a determination if it is human trafficking. And then we'll work together, the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI, to see if it's best to be worked through the federal system or through the state.
As we were sharing earlier, it's so important to citizens to be able to put faces with these
Right,
offices
right,
and these
right,
entities,
yes.
and then to see that human side, because we have men and women who are human just like the rest of us, who are really serving in these capacities on behalf of all the citizens of the state and the United States, and eventually I guess the world, because of the reverberation of things that happen here, and
Right.
it touches base with things that are happening across different borders. What are, Agent Brown, what are some of the federal laws concerning human trafficking? I know that's a big pot of things, but the best that you can for this segment, if you would share that.
Well, we have the Trafficking Protection Act that covers, it's an umbrella law that covers all the statutes that prohibits the trafficking, the recruitment, the enslaving of people, and it also allows for the protection of those that have been trafficked, to allow them to receive certain benefits, temporary visas to the United States so that they could help in a prosecution, or relocation if the circumstances warrant for them to stay in the United States and they choose to do so. It allows for a process for that to happen also.
Well, how pervasive is the crime of human trafficking?
It's
Either
probably about the third largest or most engaged in crime in the United States.
Oh my.
It follows only drug trafficking and gun trafficking.
Really?
Yes.
My. When you think about the victims and or the targets, what would you say would describe the traditional victims and or targets, and I guess there would be the common denominators, who the traffickers are looking for and who they target, and how can we be more aware based on your descriptions and based on your experience with their targets?
Well, I'd like to caution trying to make a generalization, because human trafficking is unfortunately a very underreported crime.
Right.
And so what we've been able to put together through cases that the FBI's worked and through other statistical factors from state and local agencies, we break down human trafficking in forced labor, which would be if you're working on a farm, if you're working in a sweatshop, something like that. Domestic servitude, where you're working as a nanny or a maid.
Right, right.
And then the sex industry, where you're doing pornography, all the way to prostitution. And then we've broken out crimes against children. And that's generally just to assist us in working with the Department of Justice, because they have a separate section for that. And the laws allow for that, and some of the nuances of the law need to really be drilled into and looked at. So the statistics that we've been able to put together, namely between 2008 and 2010, is that for forced labor, you're looking at a population group of 25 years or older.
Really?
Generally speaking, you're going to have people from the Far East, China, Japan, the Koreas, and Hispanic populations. Like I said, the majority of those cases will have adults that are being trafficked. For the sex industry, the majority of cases are minors. Roughly 60% of the cases involve minors that are engaged in some kind of sex industry. And the general population for those are white and black children.
Wow.
From the United States.
From the United States.
Wow.
And the age group, I know that the legal age becomes 18, but in terms of children being trafficked, I guess would be the term, trafficked.
Yes.
What is the common age group, do you find?
The average age is 13.
Isn't that something? Why do you think, Agent Brown, that the average age is 13? Is there some significance about that age?
I think it's because those children are most susceptible to the fraud, force, and coercion. And while for that age you do not have to have those elements to prove the crime, they're going to be present. And unfortunately, we have a large population of children that run away from home, and they're easily preyed upon by the traffickers.
Well, you know, now that Agent Brown has said that, Commissioner Jeter, see, that makes sense.
Yes.
Because when girls and boys decide they don't want to listen to their parents anymore, They usually decide they want to leave the home. They think they can do better. They want to go somewhere. They think they have somewhere to go. And they just don't know how the world really is. Those 13-year-olds. But I was reading something, an article a few years ago about 13-year-olds, and sometimes the 12-year-olds, are girls specifically, and I don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable, but some things, the tough topics we just really need to talk about. But girls who have reached a reproductive stage in their lives, they've experienced the menstrual cycle, and now they can become impregnated. And I wonder, in human trafficking, how significant is it to take girls that now can have children that can be sold?
I don't know if that there's any facts to support that, but I think the puberty aspect does come in because in the sex industry, most of the victims are females.
Yes.
And we have noticed that a lot of the trafficked people refer to their handlers as their boyfriend.
Yes.
And they go to great lengths to protect them for a number of reasons. And what we've been able to put together is that these traffickers have individually targeted these girls, convinced them that they love them and that they're going to provide a better life for them, and lure them away from where they're comfortable.
Yes.
And when he say that, they say they love them, they care about them. So it tells me something is missing at home. You see what I'm saying? If they're seeking some type of affection somewhere else, there's something missing at home. But this is just Commissioner Jeter's opinion. But when you say runaways, I mean, this is what we're talking about. Is this not?
Well, in general, I think traffickers do tend to target the people who are most vulnerable, and they focus on the things that make them vulnerable. So yes, people who've run away from home, not only do they not have the family support, but they also don't have the basic necessities. They don't have some place to live or food, or they don't know where these things are going to come from. So they need someone to step in and take care of them, which is where a trafficker could come in. But outside of sex trafficking in the forced labor sense, when you have people coming over from another country who are desperate for a better life, but who don't necessarily have immigration status or who might enter the country illegally, then that's another vulnerability that can be targeted. And so people can, if the immigrants are here legally, they can take away their passports so that they don't have the documents, they can prove they're here legally, or they can have this constant threat of calling the immigration authorities to deport them. So a key thing a trafficker does is find out how the victim is vulnerable and then focus in on that regardless of what the vulnerability is.
Agent Brown, but who are the traffickers?
The traffickers range from organized crime syndicates to individuals. And then the forced labor aspect of it, most of the time the traffickers are of the same nationality as their victims. And then when it comes down to the domestic servitude, statistics show that most of the people perpetrating the crime are family members.
Oh my.
And then for the sex industry, it runs the gamut. You can be involved in some kind of organized crime syndicate, whether it's a mafia type thing or a drug cartel out of Mexico. But many times it's just individuals that have gotten into some kind of criminal element, and now they're working the human trafficking aspect of it, and that they've networked with other traffickers and traffic them around.
Okay, is social media assisting this? I mean, is this the tool, one of the tools that they're using?
Yes, ma'am. The social network sites have been used by traffickers pretty successfully to arrange for the transportation or the movement of the trafficked victims for the work that they're going to engage in, whether it's forced labor and they'll be there for weeks at a time, or if it's for the sex industry and it's 15-minute increments.
Wow.
When it comes to luring, and luring is a dramatic word for just plain old kidnapping, what are some of the methods based on your experience and then carried through to prosecutions and what have you, incarcerations, what are some of the methods that you think have been some of the most common?
Well, like AUSA Gregory mentioned, the traffickers, whether they're bringing them in from an international site or if they're picking them up down the street, is generally going to cover the same aspects. What is that person looking for? And more often than not, it's not a violent snatching of someone off the street. It is a recruitment process. Someone goes out and makes contact with these kids or these people where they are, and they just do a basic assessment. Is this person vulnerable? Does this person want to go somewhere? Because it's much easier to have someone follow you than to drag them off. And then if someone wants to leave, you find out why they want to leave. Do they want to go off to Hollywood and make a movie? Right. Do they want to engage? Do they want to become a model? Do they want to go somewhere and start a new life? And then you just promise them that and say, if you want to do this, I've got a friend, or I'm that guy that could do that. So now you trick them into thinking that you're their ticket to a better life. And then they will deceive their parents or whoever's watching over them. They will not tell their parent, whatever they got to do to break away from what they think is a bad situation, and then they'll go with the trafficker.
This is interesting. Yes, it is. Is it true, or is there truth to this, and that is that socioeconomic statuses don't always guarantee that those are going to be the ones who are going to be lured into human trafficking?
That's true. You can't say just because someone is from a poor family that they're going to be more likely. We have cases where affluent females have been lured away and forced into the sex industry. We also have cases where middle income, middle socioeconomic class males have been lured away and forced into forced labor.
Agent Brown, how does the FBI find out about, the human trafficking? How do you get your complaints, if that's what you call it?
Generally, for the human trafficking, it comes from whenever a local agency has made an arrest, whether they're busting a prostitution ring, a drug raid, and they find these people, and just something steps off in their mind, says this doesn't seem right.
Right.
And that'd be the most of them. We have started working with non-government organizations like the Polaris Project in DC, Catholic Charities here within the state, that are meeting people where they're at. And folks that get trafficked oftentimes have a mistrust of law enforcement. So they won't come to law enforcement, but they will go to someone else. And we get information from those non-government organizations whenever they're allowed to release that information.
Do you often get any reports of any type from agencies that deal with girls who are pregnant and who've been put out of their homes and those types of things, and nonprofits that are trying to help them? Do you often get any reports at all from organizations like that, or maybe even the welfare system at all? Do you ever get any reports like that from them, like that?
I don't know bureau-wide, but I have not.
Okay. Okay. I wonder if there can be any connection between the foster care program, and some of the human trafficking issues that are going on. Sometimes when you get that gut feeling, you've got to pay attention to it. And I had this gut feeling one time, and I was just in a Walmart store somewhere in the United States, and there was a couple that had several children with them, and they were, I suppose they were just shopping for groceries, I'm not sure, but each of the children looked different. And I know that race and ethnicity should not be an issue when, you know, offering a home to a foster child or adopting a child. But there was something that just made me feel uneasy about that particular situation, and the way the adults were talking to the children, the way the adults were whispering to them in certain aisles, and then the parents would leave the aisle and leave the children on the aisle, and then they would meet up at a certain place in the store. And I found myself, you know, I forgot about the list I came in the store for, and I began watching this family. And as it turned out, the children were stealing, and the parents were teaching them what to do and pointing out what they wanted, and then leaving the aisles, and the children would take those items, and they were very good at it, and then they would meet up in a certain part of the store, and they were very good. And I never saw the items handed off to the parents, but I did see the children conceal the items. And when they left the store, they didn't pay for anything except just a few grocery items. And I'm always very concerned about the motives of people when it comes to children. So I guess my question, bottom line, is domestically, how concerned are you about the misuse of children and maybe some of the lower forms of trafficking?
I'm not sure how to unpack all of that, but
yes.
Anytime we get a complaint regarding any violation of civil rights aspects, we'll do a full investigation into it. And if it matches or fits under the statute, then we will move forward with the guidance of the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice. We have not had a case brought to us that I'm aware of human trafficking through the foster care system or the adoption process.
Okay.
And my thinking on that is the average slave in human trafficking costs $90. So why would you spend the kind of money that it would take to adopt a child when you could buy someone through the trafficking industry for an average of $90?
Wow.
That is remarkable in a bad way.
Yes. Either one of you can answer this, but how do you build a case against human trafficking, and can you give an example of that?
An example of types of cases, or
just how do you build a case against human trafficking?
Well, one thing about these cases is they're very victim focused. Frequently, you're going to have victims, even if there are multiple victims, who are isolated from a lot of other people, because that's one way that the trafficker maintains control over the victim, by cutting off their communication with a lot of outsiders. So the centerpiece of any trafficking case is going to be the victim's story. There's been a shift in law enforcement circles to what's called a victim-centered approach, which means there's just as much focus on making sure that the victim is safe and stabilized as there is on prosecuting the traffickers. And one reason for that shift is because the two goals really go hand in hand, because the case that you're building against the traffickers is so focused on the story that you're going to get from your victims and making sure that it's accurate and truthful. And the victim's not going to be able to tell that story until they're stabilized and feel safe. A lot of them have been taught by the traffickers not to trust law enforcement, that law enforcement's going to deport them or is going to do horrible things to them. So it takes a while to get the victim in a place where they feel safe and can tell the story. So stabilizing the victim, getting them to tell the story, is the first step in building any good trafficking case. And then from there, looking for ways to corroborate that story. If there are multiple victims, looking for ways that the stories overlap. You want to try to keep them separate when they're telling their story so that they can't coordinate, but you generally want to look for points of cross-corroboration. You also want to look for any contact that they may have had with outsiders to try to find other witnesses who can corroborate. But you're building everything around the victim's story.
Okay, I understand.
And a lot of times what this might look like is the local police department will respond and say, this is what we've come into, and we have one victim, we have 50 victims. And before the FBI starts rolling out there, phone calls are being made to non-government organizations. And here in Kentucky, the Catholic Charities has really gotten out in front of this issue And through grants and other programs that they've established and that the government has brought about and supported, they can bring in interpreters in case they speak, in case the trafficked people have a different language set. And they will assist us in identifying needs that these people have. Most of the time it's going to be clothes, because the traffickers have stripped as many things away from them as possible, or the clothes that they're wearing is not appropriate. They might need medical attention. They're malnourished. They have been exposed to the elements. And so they're going to look at that and bring that to our attention, because as law enforcement officers, we haven't been trained adequately to address some of those needs. We're looking at, okay, what are the 3 elements of this crime that we have to bring about to see if we have a case? Because in the end, you have to be able to prove those to make the case. And so they're an advocate for the trafficked people to say, okay, here we are, we're here to help you. And they're that bridge that will bring us to them and them to us. And
Agent Brown, what are those 3 elements again as you continue?
Well, you have to have, well, fraud, force, and coercion. And we need to be able to prove that those things occurred to make a successful case to fall under the statute. And generally speaking, in human trafficking, again, those aren't hard to come by, but you need the people that have been suffering under the traffickers to tell you that.
Yes.
Right.
And oftentimes, wherever they've come from, whether they're born here naturally in the United States and they're citizens, or they've been brought in from another country legally or otherwise, they have a distrust, and a huge distrust of law enforcement. And the traffickers have played on that and built that up. And so we use the non-government organization, and as much as possible we have them ready to go. And if the situation dictates, we're ready to move them to some kind of medical facility for treatment. We're able to work with the non-government organizations for temporary housing. And once you've established that, and you show the people that have been trafficked that you're there to help them out, the relationship can start moving forward. And then we're able to move forward, get interviews, corroborate the stories, and sometimes, and it's not, often, you do have to travel to foreign countries where the trafficking route started, and that will require assistance from the host country on back in whatever chain that they went through.
What are some of the things that you have in place that would take care of needs, living, food, other basic needs for life for those who have been victimized, who are now helping you? What are the things that you have in place to take good care of them so that they're not desperate anymore?
The Catholic Charities, for instance, like I mentioned earlier, they've stepped out in that. The federal government, Department of Justice, the FBI, we're not able to give them housing for even a night. We can't go buy them clothes. That's just not within our purview to do that. And so that's why it's important to have a well-rounded focus and support, so that you have the law enforcement angle that does what we do best, and then you have the social services angle that do what they do best. And we try to work together as much as possible.
Yeah, as Agent Brown said earlier, there are many nonprofits that are primarily focused on helping trafficking victims, like Catholic Charities, Polaris Project, Free the Slaves. In Kentucky, I believe there's also an organization called PATH, which is the Partnership Against Trafficking of Humans. And they frequently get grants from other organizations so that they have resources to provide housing or clothing. But each FBI office and the U.S. Attorney's Office and the offices at Main Justice also have victim witness coordinators who usually at least stay in contact with victims and are informed if they're having issues, and who try to coordinate assistance from these nonprofit groups and try to put the victim in touch with them if that's going to be helpful. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 also has provisions in the act to provide assistance to victims. So one of the provisions requires mandatory restitution in successful prosecution, so that the trafficker has to pay the equivalent of all wages that the victim would have earned. It also provides a way for victims who are in the country illegally to get immigration status. So there are lots of resources available that both the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office would try to help victims with.
Well, this has been so informative, and we appreciate you, Amanda Gregory and Agent Mike Brown, for coming to our show today. We so appreciate it. And I also want to thank Chairperson Dr. Belt for being here. It's time to go. We will see you next time on Raising the Standard. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great day.
Thank you.